Well, welcome everybody. Be sure you got a handout, and people who come in a little bit late, if you would point them toward the handout. Just because Greek is important in this discussion, and we don't all always know our Greek, so it's good to see it graphically displayed. What I want to talk about today is syncretism and hybridity, where religions come from. Now, the first thing I want to put in your mind, and it is in your handout, is what's the difference between syncretism, which a lot of people see as a positive, although some don't, and cultural appropriation. Because actually, it's pretty hard to tell the difference. And so I want you to think, because I don't have the answer, that's for sure, what's the difference and when does it happen? So syncretism is basically when something gets folded into a religion over time and becomes part of that religion that wasn't before. Easter in Christianity, for example, is a perfect example. It's a pagan holiday that slowly became a Christian one. At Christmas, I mean, as a matter of fact, we had, my wife and I went to the Halloween capital of the world yesterday, Anoka, Minnesota, for the parade, and of course there was a fundamentalist guy handing out brochures about how Halloween is unchristian. But the joke there is that it's one of the few Christian holidays, actually, because it actually developed out of a Christian calendar, unlike the rest of them. So there you have it. So when is it syncretism, and when is it cultural appropriation? Right now, every year in UU circles, we have a big fight over the Day of the Dead. The Day of the Dead, some of you know I've been traveling in Mexico for 30 years and used to teach in central Mexico. Day of the Dead comes from a particular place in Mexico, and when I started going, it was the only place you saw Day of the Dead. It's Michoacan State. It's in central Mexico. Then it started spreading. Right, it went to San Miguel de Allende eventually, and to Oaxaca, and it slowly took over, even though it was a native holiday, not a Mexican colonial holiday. Spread all over Mexico, and then it began spreading all over the world. And now you see in Target Day of the Dead stuff, right? That's kind of amazing, but you also see it in Europe. It's not just because of Latinx migration into the U.S., it's because people like it. And so much so that Disney did a blockbuster film about the Day of the Dead, right? So kind of interesting. So watching how people do that kind of thing is always interesting. There's a handout back there. Oh, you've got it. Okay, well, you were looking quizzical. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. So syncretism, by definition, is the amalgamation or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. I won't read you the wiki definition. You can look it up, or there it is. It's a big, long one. But it's about how religions blend together. And again, the best way of thinking about this is the Christian holidays. But it actually gets much more complicated than that, as I hope I can show you today. Now, what I want you to look at is on the second page, the Silk Road. Most people have heard of it. It isn't actually one road. And the map, yes, it's in black and white, so it's a little hard to see, but bear with me here. I am PowerPoint challenged, so there you go. So it started somewhere around 200 years BCE, functioning as an international thing. And it lasted into the 1700s when various empire things began to cut it apart. Some of you may know that China is very consciously rebuilding the Silk Road today. They're spending a lot of money building infrastructure in it. If you look, again, on the extreme right of the map, you see China. Also, you see that the Silk Road that we kind of imagine with camels and that kind of stuff, that is part of it. But also there were sea routes, and you'll notice that it leaves from eastern China and goes down through Malaysia and through around India. So that there was also at least 2 sea routes that ended up being part of the Silk Road. The most famous one is the one that goes across the central steppes here. But you see there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. You also notice that the terminus for that are points on the Mediterranean. So you've got Alexandria, you've got Tyre, Antioch, and Byzantium, Constantinople, right, where it ends up. So what's happening is you have, by commercial, driving money kind of thing, you've got people going east and west all the time, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So look at the religions along this route. Starting over with China, you have Confucianism, which was dominant in those years. You have Taoism, which is an older folk religion at that time going on, right? And then you have Buddhism, which is a Chinese import from northern India. All of those are coming from the China area. And then when the Silk Road crosses over, you see that one of the routes goes through India, and then also the sea routes. So you're going to pick up Hinduism and Islam, which had moved into India by part of this time, a little bit later, right? And then you're going to cross Arabia, again, Islam, after 700 of the Common Era, and through Iran, which at that time was Zoroastrian, right? So you've got a whole list of different religions that are being passed through. Now remember, Marco Polo is one of the people who used the Silk Road to travel. We know that he brought pasta back to Italy, but many people argue that if you read his diaries closely, he also converted to Buddhism. Of course, he would have been in hot soup had he said and told anybody when he got back, to the Italian state, the Papal States. But very early on, Westerners were saying, "Oh, that's a very sensible religion. They're not asking me to believe anything. I just, I'm going to meditate, and here we go." And so it was very early on, it was coming straight into the Western consciousness. So this is something to hold into your mind. So from 200 BC, and later today, for those of you who are going to be upstairs, I'm going to be talking about Cynic philosophy that starts around 400 and 500 BCE. All right, and then this is around 200 BCE. All right, so let me kind of trace you through this a little bit, just so you can begin to think about how this works in Christianity in ways that are almost invisible today. And as a matter of fact, fundamentalists would tell you this didn't happen. All right, but historically we can trace it. So cynicism appears to have developed out of the philosophy of Socrates. One of his disciples, Antisthenes, decides that Socrates didn't lean heavily enough on the idea of ethics. And so he decides that he needs to develop a Socratic philosophy that centers on ethics. So that's where cynicism comes from. The way we read it today as cynicism as being, they're all jerks, is much, much later. As a matter of fact, it's a 1600s development. So before the 1600s, that didn't exist. Okay. So then cynicism slowly decays over time and goes into Stoicism, which becomes the dominant philosophy of the late Greek and early Roman Empire, and exists up until the time Christianity stamps it out, as a matter of fact. And we can also trace lots and lots of Stoic developments into Christianity over time. Now, flip the page, and you'll see the basic tenets of cynicism. Number one is cynic is the Greek word for dog-like. And why? Because cynics lived in the street, basically. They eschewed all methods of power, position, da-da-da-da-da. All right? Now, I know it sounds weird, but we'll come back to that. Hold it in your mind. So they're kind of the original hippies. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember hippieism, remember that there was very famously, back in the hippie days, a movie about St. Francis of Assisi. And remember this, those of you who were hippies in the day, or maybe some of you younger folk have seen it. He was the son of a clothing merchant in Italy, and one day took off all of his clothes and walked out of the city. Right? So he's, throwing dad's money away in every which way. And he goes naked to a little ruined chapel and begins to rebuild it by himself. And slowly he develops then the disciples who also come out into the country, into this middle of nowhere little falling down chapel. Oh, that's exactly what the Cynics would have done. And this is one of the things to find interesting about all of this, as how it reinvents itself over time. Okay? So you with me so far? Life's goal is eudaimonia. That's also the goal in Stoicism, by the way. Eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but the original meaning is closer to human flourishing. The Stoics would not say happiness is the goal. Just not being totally stressed out and freaked all the time is basically the goal, right? And that's what we're really working for. So happiness, the translation is a misnomer, all right? EU, like eulogy, saying good things about someone who's dead. Eu means good, and daimonia is spirit. So you want to have a good spirit, basically, is what the word actually means. All right, so eudaimonia occurs when we're in agreement with the laws of nature, according to cynicism. In agreement with the laws of nature. And you see how this is a humanistic tradition then. How do you figure out the laws of nature? You have to look. Water runs downhill, etc. People age and die. This is the way it is. So get in contact with and live within those things, and you'll be okay. You won't necessarily be happy, but you'll be okay. You'll flourish, okay? All right. We achieve eudaimonia in agreement with the laws of nature through practicing virtue, arete in Greek, virtue. Virtue is achieved through lucidity. And again, that is by looking at things the way they are rather than denying reality. Oh, water sometimes does go uphill, Yes, we could live forever without ever aging. Well, sorry, get lucid on that, folks, right? And lucidity, which literally means freedom from smoke. In Greek, the word for smoke is tupos. So it's tupos. You don't have smoke in your eyes, like smoke and mirrors, right? All right, so lucidity is you don't have smoke in your eyes. So that's the way you have to live, according to the Cynics. And lucidity, of course, is achieved by looking at how reality actually works. And again, that's how it feeds directly into a humanistic viewpoint. You got to look at the world as it is. Now, tupos is caused, smoke, is caused by false valuations of what is important in life. All right? Now, think of the number of religions that tell you that, and then you see how this, how ubiquitous this idea is in many ways, and in many different kinds of religious forms. Society's values, position, fame, money, power, are all false valuations. They're there to lead you off the path of lucidity, all right? They have no value in nature. Attempts to achieve them produce only anxiety and viciousness, according to the Cynics, all right? And so, yes, reading your latest Forbes magazine will reveal the smoke that flies around in our culture, right? And the false valuations. Therefore, Cynics practiced asceticism, possibly influenced by reports of Hindu asceticism. They already had these stelae sitters, the gymnasts they were called in Hindu, Sanskrit, in India, where they would build a stelae, a big pole, flagpole, and they would climb up on top and live there the rest of their lives naked. And some people would come around and give them a little, yeah, well, but hey, it's the desert, it doesn't snow as much, but yes, in Minnesota you wouldn't survive all that long, but yes, we're talking a little bit warmer climates here. But yes, the people would come around and give water and some bread. But other than that, they just lived on top of these. And this was the most extreme form of Hindu practice. And we know from Hinduism, I mean, it's some forms, what, lightly or you'll fall off. How you sleep, she asked. Yes, so we know that this continues. I mean, you can still today find people like that. I had a good friend who lived in India for about 20 years. His hair was down to his waist by the time, and he lived in a graveyard, and this kind of asceticism. As he did go back to New York City and started drinking again eventually. So there is a happy ending to that story as far as I'm concerned. But you get the point. He has he had some pictures. He had a crooked stick and this little white garment that he wore. And now remember that the Buddha, the reason Buddhism is a heresy within Hinduism at the time is that the Buddha tried to do that by at least mythology anyway. The Buddha eventually got down to where he could live on 1 grain of rice per day. That's how ascetic he was. And then he said, you know what, this is silly. The better thing to do is to live a middle way. And so Buddhism was the middle way between total mercantilism and capitalism and over here, and then this total asceticism over there. So that was what the Buddha was teaching in northern India as just a form of Hinduism, but then it moves into China and becomes Buddhism after it's connected with Taoism and Confucianism. So again, that's a syncretism too. So, and then the Buddhism that comes into the U.S. comes just after the Second World War for the most part, and it's coming out of Japan because those of us who remember our history know that Red China shut down in 1949. And so there was no communication coming out about Buddhism because it was illegal in the country. So the Buddhism that comes into the U.S. in the mid-20th century is a Japanese Zen form, which is a Japanese understanding of the Chinese understanding of an Indian heresy from Hinduism. So there is no pure Buddhism, in other words. So, nor is there a pure Taoism for that matter. So you begin to get the idea of how these things work. So if someone says, this is the law and we will carve it on the wall, this is the truth, they're automatically lying, right? They're selling you something because that's not the way human thought works. All right, but to go back to this. Now, so we have this very extreme philosophy. I hope you will agree. But, if you travel in Mexico today, you will find old nunneries there that nuns had themselves bricked into cells with a little hole that size where they would put bread and water in. And they lived their lives with no light in these little chambers. And so, yes, people continued to do that for a long time, and I'd say you can still find some people doing it. Here's the interesting thing about syncretism. The scholar of religion, John Dominic Crossan, he taught at DePaul. He's now retired. He taught at DePaul in Chicago for many years. Wrote a best-selling book back in 2009 called Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography. Now, even though Dominic Crossan is Roman Catholic and taught at a Roman Catholic university, he's extremely liberal and tries to follow the truth wherever it goes. And this was late in his career. He's still alive, but late in his career that he began to key into something that he suspected and see what you think. Okay, this is from the biography. Jesus has been interpreted in this book against an earlier moment in Judaism's encounter with Greco-Roman imperialism. It is not, however, the elite literary and sophisticated intellectual encounter of a Philo of Alexandria. Remember, Alexandria is one of the terminuses from the Silk Road, right? Right. It is rather the peasant, oral, and popular physical encounter of what might be termed, if adjective and noun are given equal weight, a Jewish cynicism. Jewish cynicism, pagan cynicism involved practice and not just theory, lifestyle and not just mindset. In opposition to the cultural heart of Mediterranean civilization, a way of looking and dressing, of eating, living, and relating, that announced its contempt for honor and shame, for patronage and clientage, Jesus and his first followers fit very well against that background. They were hippies in a world of Augustan yuppies. All right, interesting. Greco-Roman cynics, however, concentrated primarily on the marketplace rather than the farm, on the city dweller rather than the peasant, and they showed little sense, on the one hand, of collective discipline or, on the other, of communal action. Jesus and his followers do not fit well against that background, and both similarity and difference must be given equal weight. The historical Jesus was a peasant Jewish cynic. His peasant village was close enough to a Greco-Roman city like Sepphoris. I'll come back to that, remind me, that sight and knowledge of cynicism are neither inexplicable nor unlikely. But his work was among the houses and hamlets of Lower Galilee. His strategy, implicitly for himself and explicitly for his followers, was the combination of free healing and common eating, a religious and economic egalitarianism that negated alike at once the hierarchical and patronal normalcies of the Jewish religion and Roman power. So you get the idea of what's being claimed here, that Jesus had heard about this, what he considered a way cool philosophy. Diogenes, as I'll talk about this morning at Assembly, very famously lived naked in the street. He lived in overturned wine vats, huge ceramic wine vats, like culverts, nowadays, underpasses. He lived in those naked and was a dumpster diver, but nowadays he found scraps on the street. And you can see why he would be called dog-like. He was like the stray dogs in the street of the city, right? And so, this Jewish kid says, that sounds like the way to truth and light, right? I think I'll do that too. And it's quite possible. Sepphoris is not mentioned in the New Testament, the Christian scriptures. It was 11 miles from Nazareth, where Jesus was supposed to have lived. It was the city. So if the story is true and Jesus was a carpenter, he would have been going into Sepphoris for jobs. That's where he would have found work, because that's where the money was. It was a Greek-Roman city. We know that Judaism existed in the city because they've dug around and found the ritual bath tubs that Jewish folk used in the day. So, and there were philosophers wandering around the city. There was a Colosseum for entertainment, theater, etc. And this was, again, an 11-mile walk at a time when people did everything by walking. So it's just sleight of hand that the early Christians pretended that this huge metropolis of intellectual power wasn't right up the road, right? And now we know that. They've dug it up. It did indeed get kind of, into disarray later. But the Palestine of that time, this would have been a very, very important city to go into, right? So the ideas very easily could have come into the Palestinian peasant at that time. Note the instructions, and this is from my own, and I'll do a couple more of these this morning upstairs. Jesus is reported to have given his disciples when sending them out to the mission field. Remember, this is, if those of you who went to Sunday school in your youth, Jesus sends his disciples out for the first time to go spread the gospel, and he says to them this: you received without payment, give without payment. So I gave you my knowledge. You didn't pay anything for it. So now go preach and don't charge, right? Those of you who are, don't think about that. I don't need to do that. We don't do that around. We don't do that around here. No. We pay justly. But take no gold or silver or copper in your belts. No bag. So don't take any money. No bag for your journey. Don't take a suitcase or two tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. So Jesus is saying, get out of here, take nothing with you, go preach, and beg for your food and lodging. All right. Cynicism. It's understandable as a movement because a bunch of Greeks and Romans were doing it, but no Jews were doing it. All right. So this is an introduction of a new idea into Jewish thought, probably. All right, now, so you're beginning to see how this syncretism can work in Christianity. I mean, peasant Jewish understandings of cynicism become early Christianity. Now, of course, we know that actually the inventor of Christianity is Paul of Tarsus. If you look at the map, again, the Silk Road goes over there. So St. Paul of Tarsus trained in the local school, the university in Tarsus, which was focused on Stoicism, the Greek and Roman understanding of Stoicism. In the book of Acts, now, Paul didn't write that one. He did write a bunch, and we do know, those who can read Greek, unlike me, that a lot of the letters of Paul are plagiarized pieces of previous philosophy. He lifted them directly. But Luke, the writer of the Gospel and then Acts, which at one time was one book, reports him going to preach, and he says these things. This is in chapter 17. One, he quotes epitomes by changing it a bit, and those of you who went to Sunday school will recognize this. They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one, Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But you are not dead. You live and abide forever, for in you we live and move and have our being. So that was a Stoic philosopher's writing about Zeus that Paul plagiarized and turned into a Christian statement. And we know the guy's name, epitomes. Aretes wrote this: "Let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and the harbor are full of his deity. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring." And you can see how that leads directly into the monotheistic Christian God that Paul was preaching, which again is not the Jewish understanding of God from that time. It comes from somewhere else. Right? And it comes from the worship of Zeus, who by this time in antiquity had become a monotheistic understanding for many people. Socrates sort of did that too, but it had always been floating around that polytheism was not really the truth, that there was a monotheistic king god like Zeus. So I put this at the end just for your thinking, and then we'll take some questions. Thus, Christianity as it was practiced in its first 500 to 1,000 years, that is before the popes began to say this is in and this is out, first 500 to 1,000 years, was a syncretic mixture of Judaism, Cynicism, Stoicism, Zoroastrianism from Persia, polytheisms from many cultures, including Italy, Germania, the German states, North Africa, and Egypt, with possible additions from Hinduism and possibly Buddhism and Taoism from China. Quite syncretic. From this beginning, as Christianity spread, guess what? It sucked in more and more religions. And so the pure Christianity of 500 AD is started out this way, as best we can figure from looking at historical documents. So, very syncretic. There is no pure Judaism. There's no pure Christianity. There's no pure anything. But yes, there's no, well, yes. Well, Islam, of course, is a direct copy of an Arab saying, you know, we're down and out around here. Nobody likes us. We're poor. Guess what? Those Jews and those Christians are doing much better than we are because we're polytheists, but those monotheists are doing better. So I know, let's go monotheist, and which was great for them. By 700, they ruled the entire Mediterranean basin. Yes?
And my understanding is that they think that their religion is pure because the book is a direct translation from the beginning.
Yes. The claim. Well, the claim is that Muhammad was taking dictation, and that's a little hard to take. If you look at it closely, but and yes, I don't think the book of Isaiah is direct dictation from God either, as many Christians think. Because if you are a textual critic of Isaiah, you know that actually it's three different texts just stuck together. They're from three very different time frames, and you can tell by the Hebrew how different time periods of the Hebrew. So there ain't none. Yeah.
This additive kind of religion is the same comment that I've always heard about Hinduism would be. They'd go to a new area and they'd say, oh yeah, well your God is part of ours, but it's a little sub-lower.
Right. Those of you who are reading the book Sapiens, we have a book group reading that. And he traces a lot of this. And the interesting thing about polytheism, so the Romans, right? The Romans, being polytheistic, anytime they met up with a cool god, with somewhere they invaded, they took it. Isis is Egyptian, and she became a central god within the pantheon. So in polytheism, when you meet up with a local god that you think is cool or matches up with one, you just take it and go on. So the Romans didn't burn and kill over religion or race. They were into money. They were into money and real estate, and so that was their deals, right? But so they didn't really worry about if someone was an African or Egyptian, and they didn't worry about some other idea in some way making their religion impure. And polytheism in general is that way, because if you buy the premise that there's a whole lot of gods, hey, what's not to like? So you just keep adopting. It's the idea of monotheism that becomes dangerous, because then you can only have one God, and because actually that's an idea that comes from everywhere. Then you have to start wiping out those who believe in the other one God, and so it becomes a very it becomes nasty. Yeah, it becomes nasty after a point. So what happens is then, so why were the Romans so mean to the Christians? The Romans were so mean to the Christians not because they rejected the religion. They thought it was cool. Everything's cool to polytheists. But because they would not worship the state gods. And the state gods was the latest emperor, basically. And so he was deified, right, and then put into the shrine, and you were supposed to bow and scrape. Now, did the Romans take that seriously? I mean, do you really think any educated person thought Caligula, the emperor, was God when he was going around gutting horses and killing anybody that got in his way? Probably not, but it was just it was a way of having a state religion. And so the emperor is deified, and you pay your Roman citizen, or colonial respects, or not. And if you don't, you're being resistant to Roman power. And so the early Christians were being resistant to Roman power. The more radical Jewish fringe was being resistant to Roman power. Other people weren't. Judaism actually almost disappeared. There's this Jewish Old Testament, the Christians call it, and then there's the Christian one. Well, what happened in between? Well, Alexander the Great is what happened in between, right? And he takes over, as I'll mention this morning upstairs, he takes over the world, which is not all that much real estate in their imagination. They didn't have a big imagination that way. So he takes over the world and becomes Greek. It becomes Greek thinking all through the empire, right? So the polytheism then spreads across this very big area. And it was a very cosmopolitan, another word I'm going to talk about today, cosmos, cosmopolis, it's the citizen of the world sort of idea. People were cosmopolites, and they were very accepting of other people, other religions, etc. Well, a certain factor of Judaism would not accept that. Right, the Maccabees specifically, and they rebelled. Probably if they hadn't, Judaism would have simply been syncretized into the cosmopolitan world of the time. But there was a radical fringe that refused to do that, and so they survived. In Christianity, because they were persecuted for not accepting state Roman gods, the Christians of the day were able to claim martyrdom and all those nasty Romans and all of that stuff, which, is true. Some people did get killed, right? The interesting thing about that is when the Christians take over the empire in 4 10 AD, around in there. Actually, the Christians killed far more Christians, right, than the Romans had killed Christians, because they were wiping out sects of Christianity that they didn't like, that were heretical. So the Roman Christians killed far more Christians than the pagan Romans did. So that's the way that kind of worked. And again, it was an intolerance based on a monotheism. Only we have the truth kind of idea, So, and specifically wiping out all vestiges of Greek and Roman philosophy that were left over. Hypatia, famously a woman philosopher who lived in Byzantium, was murdered by monks, right? Because she was a Greco-Roman philosopher and a woman and a mathematician, which math was actually forbidden of women because their pretty little heads would just explode. We have to protect them, So yeah, so she was killed in the streets for being a philosopher. And so it gets a little nasty, but again, the point is that monotheisms are that way because they do teach there has to be one way. Now, we can get out of that, and nowadays that's sort of liberalizing, and the Presbyterians aren't killing the Catholics and vice versa anymore, but it sure went on for a long time. Other comments, questions? Yes, Jane.
Well, I just have a question about this extreme form of asceticism.
Yeah.
Because it seems incredibly selfish. If you're walling yourself up in a room, and expecting someone to bring you bread, what's their end goal? Obviously, not every person can be a dog in the street. Somebody has to feed the community. Somebody has to make the garbage for you to root through.
They had to, yes, as a matter of fact, in Italy, after Francis of Assisi became the most popular guy in town, everybody was a Francis of Assisi follower at that point. All the young people, it was a hippie thing, right? They had to actually ban the mendicant monk tradition. They had to say, no, you cannot beg in Italy anymore, because everyone was becoming a beggar. So the Christians in the Roman Empire period had to say, stop being a martyr, because everybody was being a martyr. And guess what? There's a logical limit to how many martyrs you can have. So people, when you get into this sort of mass hysteria of something, it can definitely lead. Within the Roman Catholic tradition of the monks and nuns, it's about the power of their prayer giving back to the community. If you buy that one. But, they do. So you get the idea. It is selfish. And that's what I want to talk about this morning, upstairs, is that, yes, and there's a guy I'll be talking about who was another philosopher just after the Cynicism, early Stoicism, named Hierocles. He taught that we live in concentric circles. And the first circle is the self. So you have to develop a sense of self that is healthy. And yes, having people bring you bread and wine, or golden plates, whatever, it's still about you getting, actually. And Hierocles would say that's not healthy. So what you have to be giving out and taking in. So our job is to take in as many concentric circles as we can get. So he goes from self to family, which of course in Roman times was a much larger understanding of the number of people who were family, then to nation or city, where you're a citizen of, and then to be a citizen of the world. He was one of the cosmopolites, the cosmopolitans who believed that you had to be a citizen of the world. The Stoics said that there were two realms. There's the realm of where you live, and then there's the realm of human thought that encompasses the entire human project. And so that was the way they were getting at cosmopolitanism. So, yes, if you're living in your cell, it's just me. If you reach out and you're helping the next ring, your family, and being a good, citizen of your family, and then being a good citizen of your country, and as I will argue this morning, nowadays I think we understand, and that's where humanism comes from, right? The idea that there is a human project, a totality of universalizing rights of people. And flourishing of people. But then I think now we are increasing those circles even more. My examples, being are veganism, not mistreating animals. They are living creatures as well. Many people claim nowadays. But I'm totally fascinated with what's happening in India and in some places in South America where natural resources, as we call them here, are being declared human, to have human rights. So in India, the Ganges River is now a person by law, has to be treated as a person. Now, what that all means, I'm sure there's some lawyers working that out, but you get the idea. You don't get to just damn your neighbor, right? You have to treat that person as a person. So what if the Andes, what if the rainforest, had human rights? What if the soil in northern Minnesota is a person? It's a thought that's almost impossible for us, actually, I think. But many people are beginning to embrace it. And that's a pretty wide circle, right? Yeah.
I just want to say that if nuns had themselves walled up like that and had water and bread brought to them, they were living in a lot of their own urine.
Well, there is that too. But you are accepting the putrescence of your body, which in Christian terms, there's a dualism between spirit and body, right? And in Hinduism that exists too. That's why they also have asceticism. Asceticism is about destroying the yucky, horrible thing that says me, mine. I'm hungry, got to have sex, all those things, is driving that into a corner, cornering it so that your spirit is free. It's an old human thought. Yeah.
If this kind of education spreads, then I presume there's going to be more and more people not going to places like this.
Well, that's a good point. Yes, the churches are in some ways nodes of indoctrination toward a particular way of seeing the world. Yeah, that is true. What we are attempting to do here, and I think that goes all the way back to Dietrich's generation of FUSers, is being a place where we accept and strive for knowledge as it is, not as it would be convenient for it to be. Because it's real convenient to just accept some monotheistic ideas. What do we got here? About 5 more minutes. Yes?
Where does Scientology fit in this scheme?
Well, syncretism at its finest, right? Sitting down and coming up with your own darn religion. You can trace this idea all over the place. Think about Christian Science. Christian Science is Christianity plus a more feminized version of Jesus, who is a healer and a nurturer rather than a warrior and all of that. So, Baker Eddy took this idea of a much more feminist Christianity and fitted it into an idea of being healthier. Remembering that in the 19th century, when she started, of course, doctors did kill more people than not going to the doctor. So you have to remember that the Christian Science now is not what Christian Science was when she came up with it. Back in those days, they didn't wash their hands, people. And so that wasn't what doctors were a good thing to avoid. So, yeah, Scientology. Scientology is another one that he sat down and came up with the ideas based on. Yeah. Well, there is that. Churches, yeah. Well, he wasn't a good writer. That was the problem there. So, if he'd done a good mystery, maybe Scientology wouldn't exist. But, watch go walking in downtown St. Paul and just watch how Scientology works, right? They're going to give you this free reading to tell you how you can better live your life. And then that's the gateway, right, into this. And yeah, so, but yeah, you can look at almost any religion from the 19th century and start seeing how that they are created out of whole cloth. Yes, not all of these people were charlatans. I think Baker Eddy probably really did believe what she was teaching, I'm sure. I don't know if L. Ron Hubbard did or not. It's hard it's a little harder to accept that one. But did Mr. Smith believe that that angels were speaking to him and giving him this new faith there in New York, upstate New York? I don't know. Probably. I think he probably did, because he was willing to die for it. And go down your list of priorities, and dying is not up there with making a good living. So you have to think those things through a little bit. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at FUS Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at fusunitarian.org.